My younger brother, Caleb, recently graduated from high school. However, his journey there was far from ordinary. Caleb had failed high school twice, and his eventual graduation was a result of his third attempt. From a young age, Caleb struggled academically. School was never his thing, he always had trouble staying focused and keeping up with his peers. At first, he blamed his struggles on issues like dyslexia, but after multiple evaluations, those claims were ruled out. With no diagnoses to back him up, Caleb's frustrations turned into rebellion. He began acting out, making poor choices, and dragging my parents into endless cycles of trouble and excuses. He'd skip classes, smoke weed with older students, and get caught sneaking out to go to parties. Teachers would call my parents constantly to report his behavior, and every time, they'd scramble to fix things. My parents were at their wits' end with Caleb. They tried everything, stern talks, grounding him, and even therapy, but nothing worked. Caleb would just find ways around their rules. He'd sneak out in the middle of the night, hang out with questionable friends, or meet up with strangers he'd connected with online. What made it worse was how my parents often blamed me for his behavior. They'd say I wasn't being a good role model or doing enough to guide him. As his older sister, they expected me to show him the right path, as though I had some magic solution to fix him. At first, I tried. I'd talk to Caleb, offer him advice, and even help him with schoolwork. But he never listened. Any time I tried to warn him about the consequences of his actions, he'd snap at me, dismissing everything I said. Eventually, I gave up. It wasn't worth the constant fighting, and I was already stressed enough juggling my own college workload. Caleb was exhausting to deal with, and honestly, I resented my parents for making me feel responsible for his behavior. Caleb's first attempt at high school ended with him failing almost all his classes. He barely showed up, and when he did, he didn't care enough to put in the work. My parents' response? Instead of holding him accountable, they made excuses for him. They said he was under too much pressure, that high school was difficult, and that he just needed more support. When Caleb repeated high school, things didn't improve. He was caught cheating on an exam and was suspended, but even then, my parents didn't enforce any real consequences. They sympathized with him, saying the pressure to succeed was overwhelming, and cheating was just his way of coping. Caleb, of course, milked their sympathy for all it was worth. By the time he failed for the second time, I expected my parents to finally put their foot down. Surely, they'd realized that their leniency was only enabling him, right? Wrong. Instead, they convinced Caleb to give high school one last shot, and this time, they paid for him to enroll in a private school. They hired expensive tutors and bent over backward to make sure he had every possible advantage. Once again, I found myself wondering how they were affording all of this. My parents weren't rich by any means, and private school tuition wasn't cheap. But whenever I asked, they'd brush me off, saying they had figured it out. At the time, I didn't press them further. After years of struggling, Caleb finally managed to graduate. My parents threw him a huge party to celebrate, complete with catered food and expensive decorations. They even surprised him with a brand new car as a graduation gift. Caleb was ecstatic, and while I was happy for him, a small part of me felt bitter. I had worked hard to succeed in school and get into college, but no one had ever thrown me a party or bought me a car. Still, I tried to push those feelings aside. Caleb was my brother, and he'd been through a lot. I told myself he deserved a fresh start, even if it came at a cost. One evening, after Caleb's graduation party, I decided to stay overnight at my parents' house instead of driving back to my apartment near campus. The next morning, we were having breakfast together when my parents dropped a bombshell: they couldn't afford to pay for my college tuition anymore. I was stunned. They explained that with all the money they'd spent on Caleb's private school tuition, tutoring, and car, their finances were stretched too thin. My mom mentioned how they'd also been saving for retirement and that it was time for me to start contributing to my own education. I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. I was halfway through my college degree, with only 2 years left until graduation, and now they were telling me I'd have to figure out how to pay for it myself. I asked if Caleb would also be expected to pay for his own college tuition after 2 years, just as they were doing to me. My parents avoided eye contact, and their silence was all the answer I needed. They had no intention of putting Caleb in the same position they were putting me in. When I tried to explain how unfair this was, my dad cut me off. He said I was older and more independent, so I should be able to handle it. He even suggested that I take a year off from school to work and save up money, as if delaying my education wasn't a big deal. Their attitude infuriated me. For years, I'd watched them bail Caleb out of every bad decision he'd ever made, pouring endless resources into his education while I quietly worked my way through college. I had never asked them for anything more than what they had promised, to help me finish my degree. And now, they were pulling the rug out from under me while continuing to support Caleb without question. I left my parents' house that morning feeling lost and angry. The more I thought about what they'd said, the more it ate away at me. How could they expect me to put my education on hold, yet continue funding everything for Caleb without hesitation? It felt like they were prioritizing him over me at every turn. Later that week, I confided in my grandparents. They've always been supportive of me, and I thought maybe they'd have some advice or insight into how I could navigate this situation. I explained how my parents had suddenly stopped paying for my tuition, claiming they couldn't afford it anymore because of Caleb. My grandfather was quiet for a moment before asking, "What happened to your college fund?" I froze. What college fund? That's when my grandparents revealed something I had never known. Years ago, they had set up 2 separate college funds, one for me and one for Caleb. They had saved diligently over the years, making sure each of us would have enough to cover our education. When I turned 18, they handed both funds over to my parents, trusting them to use the money responsibly. I was stunned. According to my grandparents, the fund they had set up for me should have been more than enough to cover all 4 years of my tuition, with money left over. If that were true, why were my parents suddenly telling me they couldn't pay for my education? What had happened to my college fund? My grandparents, equally confused, offered to help me look into it. My grandfather even pulled out old financial records, showing me how much money they had saved and when they had transferred it to my parents. Seeing the numbers in black and white made my stomach turn. There was no way my parents could have spent all of that money on just my first 2 years of college. Right then and there, I decided to confront them. That evening, I called my mom. I didn't want to waste any time beating around the bush, so I asked her directly, "What happened to the college fund Grandpa and Grandma set up for me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear her scrambling to come up with an answer. Finally, she said, "Who told you about that?" I explained that I had spoken to my grandparents and seen the financial records myself. There was no point in denying it, they had proof of the money they'd saved and when it had been handed over to her and my dad. My mom's tone grew defensive. She claimed the money wasn't technically a college fund, and was instead a general family fund that could be used for whatever was needed. I wasn't buying it. My grandparents had been crystal clear when they explained their intentions, that money was meant for me and Caleb, specifically for our education. I pressed her further, and after a lot of hemming and hawing, the truth finally came out. Over the years, my parents had slowly drained my college fund. They used the money to cover Caleb's repeated high school fees, tutoring, and even his car. They also dipped into the fund to pay for family vacations and home renovations. By the time I started college, most of the money was already gone. The little that remained had been used to pay for my first 2 years of tuition, but now it was completely exhausted. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All this time, I'd assumed my parents were paying for my education out of their own savings, but in reality, they had been using a fund that my grandparents had worked so hard to save for me. And the worst part? Caleb's college fund was still completely untouched. When I asked why they hadn't dipped into Caleb's fund to cover some of my expenses, my mom brushed it off. She said Caleb needed the money more than I did because he wasn't as self-sufficient. My dad chimed in, saying that I was older, more responsible, and better equipped to handle financial stress. I was furious. Their reasoning felt like a slap in the face. Why was Caleb's future more important than mine? Why should I be punished for being responsible while he got rewarded for constantly messing up? After that phone call, I broke down in tears. I felt betrayed, not just by my parents but by the entire situation. I had worked so hard to stay on track, to be the good kid, and yet, it seemed like none of it mattered. My parents had chosen Caleb over me, time and time again, and I was left to clean up the mess. When I told my grandparents what had happened, they were livid. My grandfather immediately called my parents to confront them, demanding an explanation for their actions. My mom tried to defend herself, saying they had done what they thought was best for the family, but my grandfather wasn't having it. He reminded them that the money he and my grandmother had saved was never meant to be a family fund. It had been intended for me and Caleb, specifically for our education, and my parents had betrayed that trust. What happened next was something I never expected. After confronting my parents and getting nowhere, my grandparents decided to take things into their own hands. My grandfather, who had always been a calm and measured man, was furious. He told my parents that their actions were not only morally wrong but also legally questionable. The money he and my grandmother had saved wasn't a gift, it was meant to serve a specific purpose, our education. By misusing it, my parents had broken the trust they had placed in them. My grandfather didn't stop there. He informed them that he would be meeting with his lawyer to make some changes. Specifically, he planned to transfer the deed to the family home, which was still in his name, directly to me. The family home had always been a point of pride for my parents. My grandparents had gifted it to them years ago, allowing them to live rent-free so they could focus on raising Caleb and me without financial burdens. Now, my grandfather was taking that generosity back. He told my parents they would have two choices, either vacate the house within 30 days or stay and pay me rent, which I could then use to cover the remaining costs of my college tuition. My parents were stunned. My mom started crying, begging him to reconsider. She said that transferring the house to me would tear the family apart and accused him of playing favorites. My dad tried to argue that they had done their best for the family and that I was being ungrateful by turning my grandparents against them. But my grandfather stood firm. He told them that their years of selfish decisions had finally caught up with them and that it was time for them to face the consequences. Meanwhile, my relationship with Caleb became complicated. When he found out about everything, he was shocked. He had no idea that our parents had been using my college fund to pay for his private school fees, tutors, and even his car. At first, he apologized profusely, saying he never would have agreed to any of it if he'd known. But as the days went by, it became clear that Caleb didn't fully grasp the gravity of the situation. He told me things like, "I'm sure Mom and Dad didn't mean to hurt you, and, at least you'll figure it out, you're good at handling stuff like this." It was as though he expected me to just brush it off and move on. When I suggested that my parents use Caleb's untouched college fund to pay for my remaining tuition, he got defensive. He argued that it wasn't fair for me to ask for his money, even though my fund had been used to support him for years. I tried to make him understand the unfairness of the situation, but he didn't want to hear it. In his mind, the blame rested solely on our parents, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice anything to help me. It was frustrating, but at the same time, I couldn't entirely blame him. Caleb had been coddled his whole life, and my parents had made sure he never had to face the consequences of his actions. He didn't know how to step up or take responsibility because he'd never been taught to. As the weeks went on, my parents grew increasingly desperate. They begged my grandfather to reverse his decision, but he refused. My dad even offered to sell Caleb's car to help pay for my tuition, but it felt like too little, too late. The damage had already been done, and I couldn't bring myself to trust them anymore. Finally, the paperwork for the house transfer was completed, and I officially became the legal owner of the family home. It felt surreal, a mix of empowerment and bittersweet vindication. For so long, I'd felt powerless in the face of my parents' favoritism, but now the control was in my hands. I gave my parents an ultimatum: they could either start paying me rent or move out. There was no room for negotiation. My parents were furious. They accused me of being heartless and claimed that I was ruining the family dynamic. But I stood my ground. After everything they had done, I wasn't going to let them guilt-trip me into backing down. In the midst of all this, Caleb remained surprisingly supportive, at least to an extent. He was angry at our parents for mishandling the money and admitted that they had betrayed not just me but also our grandparents' trust. However, his support only went so far. When it came to sharing the burden or giving up his own advantages, he drew the line. I've learned to accept that Caleb and I will never see eye to eye on this completely. He's still my brother, and I don't want to cut him out of my life entirely, but our relationship will always carry the weight of what happened. As for my parents, they eventually agreed to pay rent. It wasn't a decision they made willingly, but they had no other choice. The rent money, combined with the support I received from my grandparents, allowed me to finish my college degree without taking on crippling debt. Looking back, this experience taught me a lot about family, boundaries, and standing up for myself. For years, I let my parents walk all over me because I didn't want to rock the boat. I convinced myself that their favoritism was just something I had to accept, that it wasn't worth fighting over. But this situation forced me to draw a line. It made me realize that I deserved better, that I had every right to stand up for what was mine and hold people accountable for their actions. I'll always be grateful to my grandparents for their unwavering support. Without them, I don't know how I would have made it through this ordeal. They reminded me that family isn't just about blood, it's about trust, respect, and doing what's right for each other. My parents, on the other hand, will have to live with the consequences of their choices. Whether they learn from this experience or not is up to them, but as far as I'm concerned, I've done my part. I've fought for what I deserve, and now I can finally move forward with my life. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to have radish and real stories with you. Have a great day.